Today, we're going to be learning about Chicago's first murder with the illustrious Paul Daling. He's a journalist. He's a tour guide. He's the former operator of Chicago Corruption Walking Tours. So, please put your hands together and welcome Paul.
Hello. And now to bring it down a little. Sorry, trigger warning. In an undisclosed location in the far western suburbs, in a warehouse full of newspaper clippings, architectural renderings, ship anchors, a horse-drawn carriage, a checker cab, a shed where a Maxwell Street peddler once copied keys and sold condoms, there's a cardboard box. Cardboard box contains smaller cardboard boxes. And each of those cardboard boxes contains a bone. Individual bones, separated, labeled, and packed in plastic foam. These, some believe, are the remains of Chicago's first murder victim. I've never been there, but the rabbi told me so. I will get to the rabbi later on. We did not walk into a bar, which was a loss. And I'll get to the cellar diggers who turned up a corpse under the site of the old Jazz Record Mart in 1891. And I'll get to the historian who bought that box of bones from the morgue. And I'll get to the party he held and the display they turned the bones into. I will get to all those things and more in this story, this centuries-long story of a body some believe belongs to Chicago's first murder victim, Fort Dearborn French-English Potawatomi interpreter Jean Lalime. Now, my name is Paul Daling. I am a professional science writer in the streets and an amateur historian in the sheets. I'm supposed to keep a calm face with this, but I like that joke. I'm currently researching a book about 12 murders that changed the course, that tell the story of the city of Chicago, from indigenous hunting and trading grounds to Jesuit con men to jazz malls and city and activists and kids just stuck in the wrong place at the wrong time. And finally, this. I'm trying to tell stories that are less the exception, less spectacle, less John Wayne Gacy, less Valentine's Day Massacre, and more the rule for the city of Chicago. Octavius Granati, a black political candidate, killed by a group of outfit gunmen and Chicago police officers on Election Day 1928. Mayoral aide Rudy Lozano, shot at his home in 1983. Chin Wai, whose death in 1907 helped feed a racist hysteria that would eventually move Chinatown 2 miles to the south. William Kernane, a Democratic poll watcher, murdered by his Republican counterpart on Election Day 1884. Dontel Davis, 1992. Lucretia Thompson, 1840. Laquan McDonald, 2014. I wanted to get into who these names from headlines were as people, what their stories represent about this city and this society at large. Now, me telling you all this is when you're here to learn about some French guy during the Madison administration isn't like tacky self-promotion trying to score a book deal. It isn't just... Hi, Tim. Tacky self-promotion. It's because it all starts here with the murder of Jean Lalime on June 17th, 1812. It's the murder of Chicago. It's a story of corruption, a cover-up, greed, government contracts, politics, fur hats, and nobody sent. That's for you, Bill. Lalime, or at least a partial skeleton some people believe to be him, sits in an undisclosed Chicago History Museum storage site, while his killer basks in sunlight at Graceland Cemetery, with streets, hotels, and elementary schools named for him and his family. That's because the murderer in this little mystery is the man once considered to be the father of the city of Chicago, John Kinzie. Now, you and I know that the real father of the city of Chicago is this guy, Jean-Baptiste Pointe-de-Sable. But for a whole century, until 1913, it was taken as fact by anyone who lived here that John Kinzie founded Chicago, that DuSable was a con man who tried to trick the tribes into thinking he was a great chief of the Europeans, and gave up in disgust after a few years of trying to make his little shack a success. And then Kinzie took over, and poof, Chicago. That was the lie that John Kinzie's family put into the world, reprinting for a century, reprinting the old man's fireside stories as fact in several books as authentic histories of Chicago. In 1913, however, the story started to crumble due to a historian named Milo Quaife. Apologies, I've only seen it written. In an archive in Detroit, Milo Quaife found this: the bill of sale from when DuSable sold off the DuSable mansion. And he found out it wasn't a little shack. It was a thriving enterprise. It was a farm. It was a trading depot for grain and fur. It was actually a sophisticated operation, and it was worth thousands of livres. It was a raging success. DuSable was the father of Chicago. But Quaife, pictured here, soon found other problems with the story that the Kinzie family was telling. Now, it was well known. That's going to stay up there for a while, folks. So you better. It was well known, even at the time, that Kinzie killed Jean Lalime. The family didn't shy away from it. They just painted it as self-defense. Kinzie family legend, which the Kinzie's daughter-in-law transcribed and published as 2 separate books, which were later published by later people and sort of spread as the story of Chicago, was that Lalime just was a guy who grew, quote, insanely jealous of how great Kinzie was and how great he was doing, and one day just decided to murder him, as you do. Here's a version from Kinzie's daughter-in-law's narrative of the massacre at Chicago, August 15th, 1812, and of some preceding events. One dark night, he, meaning Kinzie, crossed over to the fort. And just as he was entering the enclosure, a man sprang out from behind the gatepost and plunged a knife into his neck. It was Lalime. Quick as a flash, Mr. Kinzie drew his knife and dealt Lalime a furious blow, and a fatal one. The man fell like a log into the river below. Mr. Kinzie staggered home, covered with blood from the deep wound. Or this version, which Kinzie's former family servant told historian A.T. Andreas in 1883. Now it's, though, in daylight and there's a gun. It was sunset when they used to shut the gates of the fort. Kinzie and Lalime came out together, and soon we heard Lieutenant Helm call out for Mr. Kinzie to look out for Lalime, as he had a pistol. Quick, we saw the men come together. We heard the pistol go off and saw the smoke. Then they fell down together. I don't know as Lalime got up at all, but Kinzie got home pretty quick. Blood was running from his shoulder where Lalime had shot him. In that archive, Quaife found a third version of the story, one the history books hadn't told. He found a letter to the War Department from Fort Factor Matthew Irwin, alleging that the sainted, beloved city hero had murdered the Frenchman in cold blood in order to cover up the bribery of U.S. officials and gun running for the British allied tribes, and then organized what the history books of the era referred to as the Fort Dearborn Massacre in order to silence all witnesses. Or, to put it in Quaife's words in 1915, to those who subscribe to the traditional estimate local to Chicago, which pictures Kinzie as a kind of demigod, Irwin's charge that in addition to being a murderer and a traitor, he contrived the massacre of the garrison and settlers in order to destroy the witnesses of his crime will come as a distinct shock. That was super dramatic up till then. Shock. Although a noble spirit does big in the smallest man, here in this bar tonight, we don't have to choose between John Kinzie, the city father, and John Kinzie, the liar and murderer, because 2 things can be true. John Kinzie was instrumental in the development and growth of the city of Chicago in its early days. John Kinzie was a piece of shit. So with that, let's set the stage. All right. Did anyone get the hamburger? Okay, pretend it's a hamburger over there, you. It's a hamburger. All right, look at the hamburger. Look at the hamburgers they sell here. Beef, originally from wild aurochs domesticated in western Iran. Tomatoes, native to South America. The cucumbers that they make the pickles out of, native to India, Nepal, Bangladesh, China, and northern Thailand. Red onions, a varietal from Romania, and romaine lettuce originally from the Greek island of Kos. And if you got the fries, potatoes are from Peru and Bolivia originally. We cannot comprehend here in 2025 these centuries of globalization that led to everything, the food in our bellies, the clothes on our back, and the building we're standing in. Thank you. Now compare this to most of human history, where everything you touched, ate, used, every tool you had, everything you ate, every piece of clothing you wore, unless you're really wealthy, came from like 10-mile radius around you. And that's why the Americas were so amazing to Europeans. They were full of wonders they'd never seen. It's giant trees that were perfect to just be chopped down and made into sailing masts. Spices that could make British food taste good. And this guy. It doesn't end well, people. Please. The North American beaver. This guy built America. Now, Europe had its own beaver, the Eurasian beaver, which once lived all the way from Portugal to Mongolia. But by the 1500s, Europeans had hunted it to almost extinction for fur and to make perfume and medicine from their scent glands. By one account, by the beginning of the 20th century, there were only 1,200 Eurasian beavers across Europe. Russians have done very well with repopulation. It's about 1.5 million now. But starting in the 1850s, Europe came to this continent and found a place absolutely crawling with an even furrier, very easy to trap species of beaver. This guy, which they were ready to make into this guy. We're in a hamburger bar, people. Let's not get judgy about who's making which animal into what. The fur trade built the nation. Of course, there were other commodities pushing Europeans westward. Spanish conquistadors wanted gold. French Jesuits wanted souls. British Puritans wanted timber and greater religious persecution than was available in England at the time. But fur, it's a Garrison Keillor joke I just ripped off there. Okay. But fur was king. To give a sense about how big the North American fur trade was, the beaver population still hasn't recovered. Today, there's about 15 to 20 million beavers across North America, about less than one-tenth of what the population was when the fur trade started. Now, it was the fur trade. It wasn't the fur trap. Yeah, European could go out and kill some beavers, river otters, and deer, sell their pelts back in Europe for a tidy sum, but it was a lot less work and a lot more profitable to just buy the pelts off Native Americans in return for European goods they had never seen. Metal goods, guns, alcohol. Knowing in 2025 how this turned out for the indigenous peoples sort of brings the smug-ass moral looking down, like, why did they get involved in this? But the First Nations people, imagine you're a person of the era, and some pasty weirdo comes up with these amazing things you've never seen. Iron pots that can heat in minutes opposed to the clay pottery you rely on, and that don't shatter when dropped. Guns that feed your family more efficiently than bow hunting does. Wool blankets to keep your children warm in winter. Steel knives that skin in moments compared to stone. And all you've got to do is kill some river rats? Yeah, sign me up. I'm not in the business of picking good guys and bad guys from history. It doesn't turn out well for anyone. But thank you. But you also have to remember that the French who set up the fur trade were a lot more fair with the Native Americans than the Americans ever would be. It was not good. There was slavery, disease, alcoholism, religious conversion, but the French generally considered the people trading partners and allies in a way the future United States of America never would. The King of France was happy as long as the furs kept coming in. And then came the 7 Years' War. 7 Years' War goes by many names, but the upshot is there's a massive global conflict, and France lost bad. Shush. Let him get to it, Bill. One of their penalties was losing New France. All the land west of the Mississippi that France had claimed went to Spain. All of the land east of the Mississippi that France had claimed went to the British, including a little place called, and forgive my butchering of Miami-Antowengi language, Chicago. Starting in 1763, the French were out and the Brits were in, and it was not a smooth transition. The Brits put a dividing line up at the Appalachian Mountains, said none of the colonists should move further here, but they kept moving further here because America. And then in 1783, just 20 years later, there's this new thing called a United States to deal with. It was a crazy time. I'm glossing over entire wars here. So by the 1780s, the Midwest was basically like a spy novel in dumb hats. There were French and Spanish trappers and traders still around. There were British loyalists in the communities, the British military in Canada just to the north, newly minted Americans, endless wealth in the form of beaver pelts. And you didn't know whose sympathies were with which government or what war those pelts were funding. And that's not even counting the First Nations, which were there politically and militarily every step of the way. Different tribes were involved in both sides of the 7 Years' War, both sides of the American Revolution, had different alliances and battles with the French, British, Spanish, Americans, and each other. A Shawnee under Tenskwatawa had very different goals, allies, and enemies than a Potawatomi under Wabansi or a Miamiaki under Little Turtle. Some leaders ceded land or tried to stay neutral in order to try and save their people's lives. Others joined powerful pan-tribal coalitions to, like the Northwest Confederacy or later Tecumseh's Confederacy. Some tried to go it alone. Some wanted diplomatic solutions. Some wanted military solutions. Some still hoped for peaceful trade and coexistence. Some wanted the Europeans off the damn continent by any means necessary. We call them First Nations, it's because they were nations. They were complicated, sophisticated political organizations representing thousands of people with different goals and factions and ambitions. In the coming centuries, they would suffer a near homogeneous fate at the hands of the United States and Canadian governments, but First Nations were never a homogeneous group. And against this crazy, tense, constantly shifting geopolitical backdrop, our friend Jean-Baptiste Pointe-de-Sable came to town in about 1779. Everyone's uncle's favorite question. Now, during this whole time, Chicago to the Europeans was more a place you went through than a place you went to. The French had tried to set up a mission here in the 1690s, but it didn't take and was soon abandoned. Chicago was an important part of ancestral tribal land, but to the Europeans, it was just sort of where you took your canoe in from Lake Michigan down the Chicago River, hopped out, carried your canoe through the portage at Mud Lake, and sat down in the Illinois River and went inland. Until Jean-Baptiste Pointe-de-Sable set up this farm and trading post, currently where that dumbass Apple store is, next to Trib Tower. Now, the American Revolution was going on at the time, and our city's real father was suspected of being an American sympathizer. He spent several years in British captivity in Michigan. But after the Americans won the war, DeSable was released. In 1784, he picked up where he left off in Chicago, building the bustling frontier farm and grain and fur trading post. He did great, setting a thriving enterprise, and that he sold off for a pretty penny. In 1800, to Jean Lalime. Sale witnessed by John Kinzie, the man who 12 years later would stab Lalime to death. And with that, we're back to the murder. I've thought about John Lalime on and off for like 8 years now. I've wondered about him, I've researched him, I've tried to track down information about him. I have put in several requests to the Chicago History Museum to view the remains and have been, in retrospect, correctly rejected every time. It's a museum. It's not a place to gawk at bodies. But holding this piece of paper, which you can check out for yourself at the Newberry Library Archives if you have a reader card, is the closest I've ever actually got to him. Not much is known about Jean Lalime. Most of what was written about him came from John Kinzie's descriptions and was Almost all of it has been proven to be bullshit. This signature on a document completely unrelated to the murder is the only quantifiably true thing I've held. What is known was that he was a trapper and trader, French-Canadian, possibly mixed European and indigenous, possibly just French. His wife was Potawatomi, and he was generally respected, liked, and trusted by the tribes, the traders, and the U.S. government. John Kinzie, however, did know Lalime very well. They were co-workers under fur trader William Burnett. We don't know the specifics of why Lalime bought DuSable's trading post, but since Burnett bankrolled it and Kinzie witnessed the sale, my thought is Burnett was setting up shop here, and Lalime and Kinzie were going to run the show. I don't know who was going to do what or what roles they were going to have, but that's just my guess. Burnett was going to stay in St. Joseph, Michigan, and run things from there. But by 1803, no one knows why or how, John Kinzie was living in DuSable's mansion. I don't think it was acrimonious. Lalime had a house like right nearby. Now, when the U.S. Army decided to set up a fort at Chicago in 1803, yeah, we're there now. All right, Lalime went to work for them, becoming a translator and an intermediary between the tribes and the military. Now, fun fact, the first commander of Fort Dearborn was named John Whistler. You don't know him, but you do know his grandson, who painted this. So the next time you see this painting, remember this lady's father-in-law founded Fort Dearborn. Back to Chicago, and our first whiff of some Chicago-style deep dish corruption. By now, there were a dappling of a couple houses around DuSable's mansion. Traders, early settlers, their families, men, women, and children. And a big-ass military fort right in the background with the officers' wives and children, too. This lady's future husband, sorry, I'm wrong screen. George Whistler was just a little kid at the time, like running around, playing in the frontier settlement of Chicago. Part 3. Now, one of the suckiest parts, of the many sucky parts, of being a soldier at a military garrison at the time is that you had to buy a lot of your own stuff. And you had to buy it from a particular store inside the fort called the Sutlers. Sutler had the exclusive contract to sell goods to the enlisted men. And the Sutler could charge whatever the hell they wanted. Outrageous prices. According to one estimate, 3/4 of each paycheck given to a soldier at Fort Dearborn went to this company store. So imagine you're just an enlisted man here, right? There's a small but growing community of traders and merchants over here with high quality, inexpensive goods. But you had to buy your stuff from over here, from a special store where a person given an exclusive contract by fort leadership could charge you whatever the hell they wanted for a bunch of crap. And if you didn't, the fort captain could have you punished. And here's the kicker. The fort officers picked who got to be the sutler. This was not a sealed competitive bid era of history. You could make big money as a sutler, and it was entirely up to the officers who got the contract. So bribery was rampant throughout the garrison system. One person from Ohio offered Captain Whistler $2,000 to be named sutler, which is more than $50,000 in today's money. But Captain Whistler did not give this person the contract. It's the Air Bud rule. Ain't no rule says a dog can't play basketball. Ain't no rule that the officers who picked the sutlers couldn't be the sutlers. The factory store at Fort Dearborn was called Cooper and Whistler's. Cooper was the fort doctor, John Cooper. Whistler was Lieutenant William Whistler, the captain's son, and brother-in-law of the fort first lieutenant, Thomas Hamilton. And Daddy Whistler enforced when people wouldn't shop from his boy. One soldier was allegedly beaten just for complaining about the situation. Now here's the price list at Cooper and Whistler's versus compared to what a nearby trader known for honest rates charged for the same stuff. And you'll get a kick about who the nearby trader was. All right, so we're seeing like 50% more for whiskey and tobacco and shoe brushes, and actually double for bullets. Now, this is from a letter written to the U.S. War Department by Fort Dearborn factor Matthew Irwin, informing the War Department about the corruption, nepotism, and crony hires at Fort Dearborn. Now, I called Irwin the Fort factor, which probably should be explained. Now, remember, tensions between the British and the Americans were running red hot starting in the 1790s, and the beaver, river otter, deer pelts were at stake. Millions of dollars. Literally, millions of dollars at the time. America's first multimillionaire, John Jacob Astor, made his money in the fur trade. So, the American government started a charm offensive. From 1795 to 1882, including a factory at each new fort. It was a shop designed to trade European goods at a fair price to indigenous fur trappers for the pelts. The idea was, by actually treating them fairly, crazy, was that it would keep valuable pelts out of British hands and show the tribes that Americans were friends and allies to be trusted. It was a colossal failure. Private traders, many of whom had British loyalties, were better funded, and had higher quality goods to trade for their pelts. Also, the factories, in addition to stuff the Native Americans wanted, also had a lot of stuff that they were mandated to sell a bunch of congressionally approved goods, much of which was of no interest to the indigenous people. Tea, men and women's fine shoes, alum, Glauber salts, anti-bilious pills, green silk, calico and plaid fabrics, Morocco slippers, and, quote, fancy ribbons. That's from an 1822 congressional report that recommended scrapping the entire dumbass program of the factory system. It was a silly system, but it brought Matt Irwin to Chicago. Now, this was a guy who believed in good government, a reformer, an informant, a snitch. And the last piece that led to Chicago's first murder. Irwin worked hand in hand with John Kinzie, to boot the corrupt Cooper and Whistler's contract and let the free market prevail. The War Department responded, quietly transferring Whistler and Hamilton. Cooper quit the Army in disgust. Irwin and Kinzie won. But, as modern Chicagoans know, corruption scandal doesn't always create a reform. It often just creates a job opening. And a few years later, Matthew Irwin was probably regretting his choice of partner. Our cast is in place. We're way ahead of schedule, so I probably really should have timed this out more. But our cast is in place. We know the spy novel of British, American, French, a little bit of Spanish, and a lot of First Nations political intrigue that was the Midwest in the 1800s. We have Fort Dearborn building their house out of sticks on one side of the river, and a small cluster of traders building their house out of straw on the other side. Now let's meet the big bad wolf who kept the Americans in terror. This is Tenskwatawa, the Shawnee prophet. Now, the First Nations' response to Americans' incursions and pushes past the Appalachians were a spectrum. Some felt the return to the days of peaceful trade and coexistence that they saw under the French was the best possible outcome at this point. Some thought treaties would save their people's lives. But on the far end of the spectrum were Tenskwatawa and his brother Tecumseh, who rejected all things European and built a massive cross-tribal coalition uniting several thousand indigenous warriors from different nations and allying them with the British forces in Canada to fight back against American incursion. Every indigenous person in Fort Dearborn was eyed suspiciously as a potential secret ally or sympathizer of the Shawnee prophet. And rumors started swirling that one guy in Chicago, John Kinzie, was smuggling Tenskwatawa the guns that would win the war that he was trying to create. Here's where we get into a weird spot morally. The corruption-fighting good guys in our little story were U.S. military officials during a period of Western expansion. If our liar, thief, and soon-to-be murderer John Kinzie wins, Native people keep their lands, and Illinois stays an eternal Indian country where the fur trade money keeps rolling in. To highlight the moral weirdness, here's a quote from Fort Dearborn surgeon's mate, Dr. Isaac Van Voorhees. It was about a year before the murder. He was complaining in a letter to a friend that British sympathizers were spreading vicious lies about the Americans to turn friendly tribes against them. Quote, to inculcate the idea that we intend to drive the Indians beyond the Mississippi, and that in every purchase of land the government defrauds them. So the lie that he was complaining about the British spreading were that the United States government was going to push the Native Americans past the Mississippi and that they were defrauding them with corrupt treaties. Now, nowadays, any American ninth grader outside of like Florida can tell you that that's exactly what happened. Everything the British were telling the tribes was true. But here's the weird part. A lot of the people doing westward expansion didn't realize they were doing westward expansion. There were this, just like how the First Nations were a spectrum, the Americans were a spectrum. Some people, henceforth, sea to shining sea, divine providence, westward ho. Other people wanted to stay on the coast and just let the fur trade money come in while the Native Americans did the hard work. But in the middle, there was this sort of soft, squishy middle where people just thought that they could pick where the frontier ended. That they could say it stops with me, it stops at this settlement, at this community, where I happen to be the one making a lot of money. So the goal on both sides, in a weird way, was this eternal profitable Indian country. It was just them trying to decide who was going to be the one to get the money from it. Before you start to like Van Voorhees too much, his quote continues. Never till a prohibition of the entrance of all foreigners, and especially British subjects, into the Indian country takes place, will we enjoy a lasting peace with the credulous, deluded, and cannibal savages. He's one of the good guys in the story. I got that. All right. This whole crazy thing came to a head in 1812. I had to reuse the same picture. All right. On January 17th, Captain Nathan Held, commander of Fort Dearborn, named the new sutler, John Kinzie. The guy Irwin once used at his example of honest pricing immediately jacked up his prices. 2 days later, January 19th, 1812, Irwin wrote the War Department to inform on Kinzie, his former partner, for both the price gouging and rumors of smuggling, and his own thoughts that Kinzie was blackmailing Held somehow. He added in a P.S. that Van Voorhees shared his opinions. March 10th, Irwin wrote that he had discovered that Kinzie bribed his way into the sutler contract, but he probably didn't need to because he was wired. He had clout. He was connected. This is Chicago. The Fort Lieutenant, Lanai Helm, was his son-in-law. Over the months, Irwin started picking and unraveling this conspiracy. And along the way, he discovered two allies who shared his disgust at this corruption. Van Voorhees and Jean Lalime. In April 1812, a band of Winnebago killed two white settlers at Lee's Farm in the nearby community of Hardscrabble, today which is known as the neighborhood of Bridgeport. Hardscrabble's a much better name. Kinzie and Helm cried for blood, vengeance, not just against the Winnebago, but against the American-friendly Chippewa and Ottawa tribes as well. Quote, Propositions were openly made to murder them, as well as some French persons with Indian wives who have, ever since they have been here, manifested peaceable dispositions, Irwin wrote the War Department on April 16th, 1812. The principal persons who advised and insisted upon such measures being carried into effect were the sutler for this garrison and his son-in-law, Lieutenant Helm. Kinzie was back at it. Kinzie, Lieutenant Helm, and Ensign George Ronan spent months stoking anger among the soldiers against the tribes, and Held did nothing. Ronan threatened to shoot Lalime. Helm swore he would take the scalp of the factor. Held did nothing. Held did erase Helm in May of that year for plotting to murder 6 Sauk who had come to the fort in peace. But he demanded a very firm apology first before he released him. He had to say he was sorry for planning to murder 6 people. On June 17th, 1812, there's that date again, around 6 p.m., inside Fort Dearborn, Helm went off. He went on a tirade about Irwin to Van Voorhis and Lalime, concluding, according to a June 30th War Department letter from Van Voorhis, by saying he would give a very handsome treat if the factory would be done away with. Kinzie took his son-in-law's side of the argument. Jean Lalime stood up for Matthew Irwin. Quote, the unfortunate interpreter defended the pure motives and just dealings of the institution. Isaac Van Voorhis. Telling these scandalized frontier tales about flashing blades and assassins striking in the dark, that's the Kinzie's game. And unfortunately, the version here is not as entertaining because we're getting this from official communiques to the United States War Department, not from frontier tales that Juliet Kinzie promoted to turn her father-in-law's campfire stories into history. We do know this. A knife came out, and Lalime was dead. Kinzie turned and saw that Matthew Irwin had seen everything. He called out that he was a lost man. Ronan told Kinzie to run. Helm helped Kinzie. Held did nothing. Murder had come to Chicago. Lalime's body lay at Kinzie's feet by the corner of what's now Wacker in Michigan, just west of that hockey souvenir shop. There's a little outline of the fort boundaries in the sidewalk around there. After the murder, Kinzie hid in the fort garrison for about 4 hours until Lieutenant Helm walked him to the river's edge, shook his father-in-law's hand, and let the future man who'd claim he founded Chicago run free. Although Kinzie was seen prowling the area for days, and a sentinel saw Helm sneaking Kinzie food and wine, half-hearted effort after half-hearted effort failed to capture the killer. Held turned the sutler post over to Kinzie's brother. It got tense. A few strange tribal members that Irwin had never seen before started hanging out the factory. Irwin started bunking with Van Voorhis so that they could watch each other's backs. Then the worst possible thing happened. The War Department wrote back. The letter said that they had received Matthews Irwin's January 19th letter and would order Held to regulate how much Kinzie's sutler shop charged the men. I'm not calling the war. I mean, you're trying to get a letter from Chicago to D.C. in 1803. You're going to get the return rate you get or will get under Trump. I should have vetted that one. The letter came, unfortunately, through official channels, which meant the fort commander goes through the mail. Held saw the letter before Irwin did. Now Held, the fort commander, knew that Irwin had been snitching and that Van Voorhees was in on it. That same night, Captain Nathan Held issued a report that the fugitive Kinzie had been spotted. He ordered Matthew Irwin to apprehend him out in the woods at night, alone with Ensign Ronan. Irwin refused. When Irwin refused, Held ordered him out of the garrison, and he started sleeping in the factory. He reassigned the soldier who had been waiting on Irwin and gave Irwin 6 days to find a replacement for the soldier. He wrote an angry letter to the War Department calling Irwin a false friend, and then he destroyed Irwin's vegetable garden literally out of spite. Irwin left Fort Dearborn to hire a new interpreter. He arrived in Fort Mackinac just in time to become a British prisoner of war. By the time he was released a couple months later, it was too late to go back to Chicago, where he would have just ended up as one of the other dead. Apologies for the racist imagery of the Battle of Fort Dearborn, but there's no imagery of the Battle of Fort Dearborn that is not racist. But for centuries, it went by a much worse name, the Fort Dearborn Massacre. Unconnected to the Frenchman's lonely death at Fort Dearborn, British-American tensions erupted a few days after Lalime's stabbing in the War of 1812. After Fort Mackinac fell to the British, Held was ordered to evacuate Fort Dearborn. Aware of the impending departure somehow, a splinter group of Potawatomi attacked the refugees a mile and a half from the fort on the lakefront near 18th Street today. 86 of the 148 men, women, and children who lived in or around Fort Dearborn were killed. The remainder were taken prisoner. The tribe then burned down the fort. Irwin learned about this after being released from British captivity, and he blamed one man, John Kinzie. Quote, "The plots entered into by this man to destroy friendly Indians, the methods he has taken to inveigle the officers, with the exceptions of the surgeon's mate, into improper concerns, his bold and menacing conduct to the citizens if they dared to doubt his attentions, all tended to convince me that he felt an interest in bringing about an Indian war. Should he not have been instrumental in the fate of Chicago, I shall be much deceived, because if he fulfilled his part as emissary, he had it much in his power to preserve his own life by destroying the witnesses of the murder of Lalime." That was what Matthew Irwin wrote to the War Department on October 12th, 1812. The War Department wrote back on October 27th, saying that since the Fort Dearborn factory was no more, Irwin's services would no longer be required, but that his salary would be continued until he felt ready to come back to work. There was a war on, and a fort to rebuild at Chicago. One dead Frenchman was a mystery that no one had time to look into. In the year 1891, Chicago was the nation's second largest city, a booming metropolis of more than 1 million citizens, the town all a tizzy with preparations for the upcoming World's Columbian Exposition. That was the year a group of cellar diggers building a brand new structure at Illinois and Cass, Wabash. Quote, "Were startled by having the shovel stopped by a skull." They eventually turned up this, which historian Joseph Kirkland soon became convinced were the remains of Jean Lalime. He bought the bones from the Cook County morgue at merely a nominal expense and had a display case built to be presented to the Chicago Historical Society. This was on display at the Chicago Historical Society, currently the Chicago History Museum, from 1891 until some point in the 1950s. No one knows when or how or why it went into storage. And in 2012, The Chicago History Museum had an exhibit called Shalom Chicago about the history of Chicago's Jewish community. In Jewish tradition, there is a group that consider themselves a priestly clan descended from Moses' brother Aaron. They're called the Kohanim. And their religion requires they stay clean of the impurities coming from dead bodies, and they cannot even be in the same building as one. It seemed a lousy trick to put on an exhibit about Jewish Chicago at a building some of the most observant Jews couldn't even walk into. So upon consultation with an Orthodox rabbi, the CHM moved the bones off-site to an undisclosed suburban storage location with the newspapers, ship anchors, Checkers cab, and a shed where Maxwell Street peddler copied keys and sold condoms. I've never been there, but the rabbi told me so. Thank you.